Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Naya Daur. I'm Rabia Mehmood. Today we brought Awam Ki Baat to you, but it's going to be, first of all, I should just say that it's going to be mostly in English because we have a very special guest who's going to speak to us about like a grave humanitarian crisis, which is in our region, but actually affects like more than our region. And we have our guest today is Heather Barr, who's the Associate Director for Women's Rights with Human Rights Watch. And she's also the former Afghanistan researcher with Human Rights Watch. And she has also previously worked with the United Nations in Afghanistan. Heather is going to speak to us about like this really big issue, which the world, anyone who cares about human rights, anybody who cares about people's lives or children or women or just like basic stuff, human life of and dignity of a person cares about, and that is the like a colossal level of humanitarian crisis which is unfolding in Afghanistan at the moment. The United Nations has been saying that Afghanistan is on the brink of an economic collapse. The humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan is going to be bigger than Syria and Yemen, they're saying. And this is not just the United Nations agencies, this is our all international human rights bodies and other humanitarian organizations as well. And this has started happening and exacerbated since the Taliban took over Afghanistan on August 15th. Of course, even prior to that, the human rights conditions in Afghanistan and the humanitarian crisis was already there, and it was escalating. So starvation and food insecurity and many other issues were still a problem. But now it's grown beyond anyone's imagination. And one of the biggest reasons for that is that the assets of the Afghan government have been frozen in the United States and by the United States government. And also there was also an aid suspension, but that's just kind of like there are certain unblocks which are happening. And also the economy is just like is paralyzed, and people are in such bad shape that even if they do have some money, there is no cash in the country. This is just a small example of how bad the situation is. And adding to that is like the other concerns that there is like a massive human rights crisis in the country too, because Taliban coming into power means that all the gains which were made by civil society and Afghan people and the press and rights defenders and are being snatched away from them. And there's already a security concern because we know that ISKP is carrying out terrorist attacks against civilians and also like fighting with the Taliban. So it's just like it's multiple disasters. This is what I'm trying to say. Heather is going to address this one big issue that a lot of conversation is how to help the Afghans without helping the Taliban. And if we are helping the Afghan people, does it mean that we are helping the Taliban? And these are some of the questions that even like everyone's confronted with. And some people are trying to create this binary that this is human rights is one thing and the humanitarian crisis is one thing. So Heather, I am going to, we were speaking briefly about before this interview as well. Can you just sort of address this forced binary at the moment, although a lot of people have genuine concerns, and really tell us how is it that we can help and how is it that we should think of helping the Afghan people, basically, and would you agree that the humanitarian crisis is basically a human rights crisis and it enables human rights violations? And also, sorry for the very long question, who are some of the biggest victims of these crises? Yes.
Thank you so much, Rabia. Thanks for inviting me. So yeah, this has been something I've been finding very frustrating, is there's been some rhetoric that kind of says, well, women's rights is important, but we can't worry about that right now because there's this humanitarian crisis and we need to deal with that instead of dealing with women's rights or with human rights more broadly, because of course there are other serious human rights violations happening in addition, being perpetrated by the Taliban in Afghanistan now, in addition to the ones that they're committing against women and girls. And the reason that is, as you say, a false binary is because the humanitarian crisis is also a human rights crisis. Food, shelter, water, life, these are all human rights as well, and these are being violated. And something important to say about that is that that crisis also disproportionately affects girls and women. Something we know from research that's been done all over the world during humanitarian crises is that when there's not enough food, girls and women don't get as much food as boys and men do. And that leads to higher rates of malnutrition, for example, among girls than among boys. And there's some evidence that we're seeing that in Afghanistan, which is not surprising at all. There are some other reasons why the humanitarian crisis is hitting women and girls harder than men and boys in Afghanistan. Those reasons include the fact that one of the first things the Taliban did is push women out of most paid employment. So even before the crisis started to hit all families, households which were headed by women or where women were the main wage earners had already lost their income because of Taliban policies. And there are many households like that in Afghanistan. You know, there are many widows. Many men have been killed in the conflict over the last 40 years. So there's that problem. And then the Taliban also really put a lot of restrictions on preventing women aid workers from doing their jobs. And having women aid workers who can reach out to women-headed households and to women and girls is part of how you try to prevent this disparity about who's getting food, who's going to survive during a time of hunger. So for example, we looked at a month or so ago and in 16 provinces, the Taliban were saying that women aid workers could only do their jobs if they had a mahram with them the whole time. So that makes it pretty impossible actually for a lot of those women to be able to work at all. You may have seen some really heartbreaking stories about families that are in such desperation that they've sold their children to buy food. And one thing that you notice when you read those stories is that the children who are being sold are almost always girls. So all of that is a very long way of saying that the humanitarian crisis is a human rights crisis and a women's rights crisis. Sorry, did you want to come in or shall I try and answer your other questions?
No. Actually, no, I want you to keep going and also want you to address like how suspension of aid and freezing of assets also impacts, right? Because I also saw you shared this story of like how kids are being born in Afghanistan at the moment because the hospitals don't have any money. And then at the same time, Human Rights Watch has done some research and has been raising this from day one since August 15, and Amnesty has done this research, and even United Nations has also raised this, that like how the suspension of aid and like because there's no money, which is because it's an aid dependent economy, women's aid centers are basically also and like domestic sort of like various sort of aid centers which are helping women with their issues have stopped working. So also just if you could just add that. I'm sorry for disrupting.
No, it's fine. So it's impossible to overstate how serious the situation is in Afghanistan right now. You've cited some of the statistics. The story you mentioned about women giving birth is an article that came out yesterday that talked about how hospitals have so little in terms of supplies and equipment that doctors are performing cesarean sections for women who are in labor by the light of cell phone flashlights, which is pretty shocking and terrifying, honestly. The health experts, for something to be officially declared a famine, they look for 3 factors, and the 3 factors are about the percentage of children who are malnourished, the percentage of adults who don't have enough food to eat, and the number of people who are actually dying of malnutrition. And Afghanistan is at the point now where it's met the first 2 criteria. The only criteria that it hasn't met yet to be declared a famine is the number of people who are dying, but that's going up every day. So let's talk about how this happened and who can solve the situation. And frankly, there's one person who can solve this situation, and that's Joe Biden. And I'm so angry and ashamed that that he hasn't done that. That he, yeah, I mean, I think the United States seems desperate to forget that Afghanistan ever existed. I think this has been a humiliating military defeat for them. I think that Biden himself, like, somehow blames the Afghan people for the Taliban returning. You know, you hear him talking about how the soldiers didn't want to fight for their country. It feels like Biden and his government think that it's appropriate to somehow punish the Afghan people for, you know, their feeling, for the Taliban's behavior, for their feelings about, you know, what did or didn't happen in terms of how the military fought the Taliban. I mean, you know, we could get into a lot of details about whether the Afghan army really had the infrastructure and support that they needed to be able to fight, but that's kind of beside the point, because the point is that people are dying of hunger right now. And it's because of policies by international donors in general, but particularly by the United States, because the United States led the international effort in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And the United States has a huge amount of say over the actions of institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the US is using all of that influence to block money from going to the Taliban. As you said, 75% of the Afghan government's budget on August 14th was coming from international donors, and the US was the most important of those. The US and its partners built that economy over the last 20 years. They created a situation where the government was completely dependent on aid. And then they pulled the plug on that aid like overnight on August 15th. And that's why people are hungry, and that's why people are starving. So the main thing that needs to be done is that the US needs to take responsibility for this situation and not just provide humanitarian aid. Providing humanitarian aid is of course necessary and urgently important to save lives, but the longer term, or even medium term solution is not about aid. It has to be about the economy functioning again. And so unlocking the reserves, the connection with the international financial system, allowing the banks to function, allowing the central bank to function, allowing people to go back to their jobs and earn a paycheck and feed their families. And this is what the US has has prevented, and the US's approach has been really lacking in urgency. You know, there have been discussions between different governments, discussions within the US, but none of it has happened in the way that you would expect when people are actually starving. It's been sort of like, yes, well, we had a meeting last week, we'll have another meeting next week, we'll think about it. We're certainly looking into that, you know. It's very shameful.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've explained it so well for anyone who hasn't even like followed the news or read up on this. And I'm constantly quoting from organizations like yours and the United Nations agencies, because these are people on the ground and are looking into it, and we're just like reading up on what they're saying and what experts are saying. And I was just reading up on the UN humanitarian chief or humanitarian chief's statements, and he said that the impact of the collapsing economy is violent. Basically, it's way more violent. This is the word he'd used. Way more violent than they had even expected, and they were issuing like these massive, warnings. And it was like I had already said that it's going to be one of the most unprecedented crises that's going to that the world is going to face, basically. And of course, like you're saying, that they're saying the use of violence is just so critical, right? Because starvation is also a kind of violence. People are dying. It's not just that they're hungry. It is a certain kind of violence from like not letting people eat because, or not helping them have access to some of the most basic things in life to survive. The rest comes later. And also there's this sort of that by the end of the year the economy has to restart in some way, and the end of the year is here. There's 7 more days, and like you're saying, that it's just been like there's a lack of urgency, right, in the way in which like steps are being taken. Yeah, like a small percentage is going to be allowed for humanity through the World Bank, and that process hasn't really, been finished yet, from what I know, because it was just reported this like 7 or 8 days back by Reuters. And then we and and such information is coming out like, yes, people can send back their remittances, but that's not enough, because people can still not withdraw from the banks because of the liquidity crisis, and that's just too technical for, so we're not going to get into that. But so can you also, although you've explained this to us, but also just kind of like thinking of like some of the research which is being done by Human Rights Watch on like disappearances and detentions, and like, and we keep saying that Taliban are like promising that we're like, even on December 10th there was a statement that we respect rights and
Can't hear
stuff.
you. I lost you. I
So
lost you for a
yeah,
moment. Sorry.
and okay, sorry, no, I'm saying that we, so even Taliban, so coming now, sort of moving to like the victims of like the kind of like rights violations that Taliban have perpetrated on people before during their last sort of rule, quote unquote, and from 96 2001, and even now, we do know that the situation in Afghanistan is really critical at the moment. 80% of the women journalists are unemployed. 257 media outlets have stopped working. It was like a thriving industry before, right? And despite all the issues before, this is Reporter Stands Frontiers in Afghanistan Union of Journalists research that I'm quoting. And yet Taliban is saying that, and they keep on issuing these really restrictive directives through the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, and like against women, against journalists, and we do know that girls have not gone to school, which is a complicated issue, because some is because they're not being allowed to, and in some areas people are saying that families are scared to send their daughters to school because there's more to this story. So can you also just like walk us through on like what kind of rights violations are taking place at the moment by the Taliban's interim government? Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So as an Afghan colleague of mine said, there is no Taliban 2.0. Taliban is Taliban. And I think that's a pretty accurate statement. In terms of, if you look at the differences between how the Taliban is, what policies they're enforcing now versus in 2001, I think that the big difference is that they now seem to accept that girls should be allowed to go to primary school. They think it's okay for women to learn to read and like have some basic math, but no need for more than that. So on September 18th, they reopened boys' secondary schools and not girls' secondary schools. A few provinces have managed to open some schools, but that's 7 provinces out of 34. So 27 provinces across the country where all teenage girls are being denied access to grades 7 through 12. That is shocking. That's the only country in the world that has an official policy of denying children education based on their gender. And our view is that a country that does that just cannot be an entity that does that cannot be seen as legitimate government in 2021. Afghanistan has signed up for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. They ratified it in 2003. Virtually every country in the world has signed up to this convention. It's clear that every country is obliged to be working toward gender equality. Nobody's achieved it yet, but we're all supposed to be working toward it. And so a rollback of the type that's happened in Afghanistan is really beyond the pale. Education is just one piece of it. As I said earlier, they've banned most women from paid employment. The only employment that they're allowing women to have for the most part is teaching primary school or teaching girls primary school or teaching girls secondary school in the few places where secondary school is open for girls, or working in the health sector, providing health services to women. They really seem to see it as being acceptable for women to work only in jobs that they think men can't do. So for example, they fired the women from working for the Kabul city government, and they made exceptions only for women toilet attendants, because they thought that men couldn't be attendants in women's toilets. They let women go back to work at the airport because they needed women to do body searches of women. But any other kind of occupation, any occupation that can be done by a man, no need for women, seems to be their approach. So that's one thing. Another is that one of the things that Afghan women's rights activists had to fight so hard for, and had some real success on, was fighting for a system to respond to violence against women, domestic violence, gender-based violence. So Afghanistan on August 14th had a system of shelters across most of the provinces where women and girls could go if they needed to flee violence. There was a law on elimination of violence against women that was passed in 2009. There were specialized courts and specialized prosecution units set up to bring cases under that law. All of this has been dismantled by the Taliban. There aren't any women prosecutors anymore. There aren't any women judges. The law on elimination of violence against women is essentially a dead law, and the shelters have been systematically shut down by the Taliban. So that's another area. And then, I mean, there's freedom of movement, of course. Taliban in some areas are requiring women to have mahrams with them anytime they leave the house, even though the Taliban in Kabul have said that's not their official policy. Women are being harassed on the street over what they're wearing, over things like them not wearing gloves or not wearing socks. Every Talib with a gun seems to be in charge of making up his own dress code. And it's also, and the last thing I'll mention is barriers to accessing healthcare. There's been news in the last couple of days about a province called Ghazni, where the Taliban has said that women can't go to the doctor without a mahram with them.
Wow. Yes, and I was just looking at something that a Tolo News journalist had tweeted, that the taxi drivers have been told to not have women in their taxis just by themselves, or if they're not properly covered or something, or just like, again, what you've been saying, without a mahram. And yes, it's all quite all quite devastating as to what's happening in Afghanistan. And I'm just kind of like, to wrap our this very informative interview with you, we're in South Asia, and where Pakistan is like, out of the 4 land bordered neighbors of Afghanistan, 2 are open. Pakistan is like one of the key neighbors. I'm using quotes here, and it's been like campaigning for recognition of Taliban in some capacity, right? And sort of actually basically campaigning on its behalf. And without getting into the history of this relationship, we just know that, like, whatever Pakistan Prime Minister has just said that, he said something really awful about the Pashtun culture recently, and I'm not going to repeat that, but it's also said that human rights and women's rights are different in different societies, and something to that effect. And and we're all here, and we need to extend our support and solidarity, and we need to like advocate and like actually basically just extend solidarity and support to Afghan people. What should be some of our asks, and what should we ask for, and how should we approach this in the region, basically? Say, for instance, like, the human rights community and the people who are in the movement in Pakistan or in Sri Lanka or in India or Bangladesh, beyond the politics of our countries, as allies and supporters. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when your neighbor's house is on fire, you worry about your neighbor, and you also worry about your own house, whether the fire is going to spread to you. And I think that, what's happening in Afghanistan, and the way that the Taliban have rolled back women's rights, and the weak international response, has implications for feminists everywhere in the world, and particularly in this region. And so in terms of solidarity, of course, everyone needs to be pushing for humanitarian assistance, unlocking the Afghan economy. But also in a short-term, medium-term, long-term way, we also have to be saying to our governments that a government that rolls women's rights back in this way can't be legitimate, can't be seen as a real government, and there has to be continuous pressure on the Taliban to say that this is unacceptable. Not just the attacks on the rights of women and girls, but the extrajudicial killings, the crushing of media freedom. These are things that we all value. And if a government in one country can get away with these things, then it makes all of the rest of us less safe. And so I think and I think it's important also to remember that some governments have more ability than others to talk to the Taliban and to influence them and to say to them as a friend, not as, for example, an invading power, look, like, we're old friends, but this is not okay. And I really appreciated, for example, at one point, Imran Khan saying that it's un-Islamic for the Taliban to deny girls access to education. I think that means far more than, many hours of whatever Joe Biden thinks about things in this particular context. And so I think there's a lot of space for feminist movements in this region to be in solidarity with Afghan women and to be talking to their governments about how governments in this region and other governments, within the OIC and elsewhere can be trying to reason with the Taliban and explain to them that this is going to have to change.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful. Thank you so much for putting it all into perspective for us, taking the time out right before, it's the 23rd of December, although you've all been working very hard, but it's also just like, it's so unfortunate that the most of the world is going to go on holidays while this like millions of people in Afghanistan are basically just like struggling to live. Thank you for giving your recommendations as well. And we should keep listening to experts and also women from Afghanistan and other human rights defenders from Afghanistan, and then basically just try and do our best to support them. Thanks so much, Heather. And thank you for watching Neador. Keep watching. Khuda Hafiz.